So I had this idea to start recording videos on the IBM System 370 publication called Principles of Operation. Just a neat looking old manual from IBM. And like usual, rather than do this by myself, I thought I'd take some people along with me. I'll be reading from the 11th edition, which came out in September 1987, it looks like. This major revision obsoletes and replaces, and then they put the publication number. 2 of them, and then technical newsletters. I guess technical newsletters has numbers. There's 2 of those. Significant changes or additions to the text and illustrations are indicated by a vertical line to the left of the change. And then here's a bunch of business, non-technical information I'll be skipping over. Looks like they give us a summary page, though. It says, this publication provides, for reference purposes, a detailed definition of the machine functions performed by System 370. Okay, and then rather than stay on this page, I'll go ahead and switch over to the text-to-speech application I use. I'm sure we'll be back on that page soon enough. The publication applies only to systems operating in System 370 mode. The IBM 370-XA Principles of Operation, which is a different publication number than the one we're reading from right now, that should be consulted regarding the functions of the architecture which apply to systems operating in the 370-XA mode. And the IBM 4300 processor's Principles of Operations for ECPS:VSE mode. They did an awful job of dictating that. But this publication describes each function at the level of detail needed to prepare an assembler language program that relies on that function. It does not, however, describe the notation and conventions that must be employed in preparing such a program, for which the user must instead refer to the appropriate assembler language publication. This publication is written as a reference and should not be considered an introduction or a textbook. It assumes the user has a basic knowledge of data processing systems. IBM publications relating to System 370 are listed and described in the IBM System 370. Okay, I'm going to skip the rest of that. Bibliography is where they're pointing us to. All facilities discussed in this publication are not necessarily available on every model. Furthermore, in some instances, the definitions have been structured to allow for some degree of extensibility, and therefore, certain capabilities may be described or implied that are not offered on any model. The information presented in this publication is grouped in 13 chapters and several appendixes. Chapter 1 is an introduction, highlights some of the major facilities of System 370. Chapter 2 is organization. This describes the major groupings within the system, the central processing unit, storage, and input-output, with attention given to the composition and characteristics of those groupings. Chapter 3 is all about storage. This explains the information formats, the addressing of storage, and the facilities for storage protection. It also deals with dynamic address translation, also known as DAT, which, coupled with special programming support, makes the use of a virtual storage possible in System 370. So that's interesting. They say special programming support. That makes the use of a virtual storage possible. A dynamic address translation eliminates the need to assign a program to a fixed location in real storage, and thus reduces the addressing constraints on system and problem programs. Chapter 4 is about control. This describes the facilities for the switching of a system status, for special externally initiated operations, for debugging, and for timing. It deals specifically with CPU states, control modes, the program status word, control registers, program event recording, timing facilities, resets, store status, and the initial program loading. Chapter 5 is titled Program Execution. This explains the role of instructions in program execution. It looks in detail at instruction formats and describes briefly the use of the program status word, of branching, and of interruptions. It contains the principal description of the dual address space, the dual address space facility. It also details the aspects of program execution on one CPU as observed by other CPUs and by channels. Chapter 6, Interruptions, details the mechanism that permits the CPU to change its state as a result of conditions external to the system, within the system, or within the CPU itself. 6 classes of interruptions are identified and described: machine check interruptions, program interruptions, supervisor call, external interruptions, input-output, and restart interruptions. Chapter 7 is titled General Instructions. This will contain detailed descriptions of logical and binary integer data formats and all unprivileged instructions except the decimal and floating point instructions. I'll speed through the rest of these. Chapter 8 is decimal instructions. Chapter 9 is floating point. Chapter 10 is control. 11 is machine check. 12 is operator facilities. And 13 is input-output operations. The appendices include information about number representation, instruction use examples, lists of the instructions arranged in several sequences. Let's jump back to the actual manual to read the rest of these. There's a summary of the condition code settings, a list of the System 370 facilities, a table of the powers of 2, tabular information helpful in dealing with hexadecimal numbers, an EBCDIC chart, a discussion of changes affecting compatibility between 360 and 370. And the last appendix is a discussion of changes affecting compatibility. In this publication, the letters K and M denote the multipliers 2 to the 10 and 2 to the 20, respectively. Although the letters are borrowed from the decimal system and stand for kilo and mega, they do not have the decimal meaning, but instead represent the power of 2 closest to the corresponding power of 10. Their meaning in this publication is as follows. So there's a symbol, and there's the value. The following are some examples of their use. So 2K, 4K, 64K. Bytes, characters, and codes. Although the System 360 architecture was originally designed to support the extended binary coded decimal interchange code, EBCDIC, the instructions and data formats of the architecture are for the most part independent of the external code, which is to be processed by the machine. For most instructions, all 256 possible combinations of bit patterns for a particular byte can be processed, independent of the character which the bit pattern is intended to represent. For instructions which used the zone format, and for those few instructions which are dependent on a particular external code, the instruction translate may be used to convert data from one code to another. Thus, a machine operating in the System 370 mode can process EBCDIC, ASCII, or any other code which can be represented in 8 or fewer bits per character. So that's interesting. They're saying code instead of encoding, which people nowadays is probably more familiar with saying when they're reading about something related to ASCII or EBCDIC or whatever encoding they're reading about. And so we'll actually finish this video and call it introduction, but we'll finish the video with this table of contents. Here's that chapter 1, introduction. They finish this chapter with the topic availability. Chapter 2, organization, covers main storage, CPU, I/O, and operator facilities. Chapter 3 is storage addressing, address types, storage key, protection, reference recording, change recording, prefixing, address spaces, ASN translation, ASN authorization, dynamic address translation. Wow, the storage chapter is pretty thick. Chapter 4, control. Yeah, you can pause here if you really wanted to read these, else I'm just going to dive in the next video, starting with chapter 1. Unless you went to the site to read along, I want to just scroll through here so you have the ability to pause if you wanted to check out anything in particular here. 13 chapters, they said this Principles of Operation book contain. And I by no means imagine being able to read all of this. Let's see how far this video series goes. Okay, so we'll stop right here. Chapter 1 introduction. See you in the next video.